Guten Abend, dobry wieczór, good evening. I'm happy to welcome everyone to the first event accompanying to our new temporary exhibition. This temporary exhibition tells the story of women's rights over 1 century ago. And I have to confess, I hadn't heard many of the names included of the women included to this exhibition before. And this is quite close to my perception or my idea of history being an ongoing discovery of people, of processes, of meanings forgotten or not enough known. And the science, the historical sciences can help us to discover, to help us to conduct this battle for these meanings, for this unknown or forgotten names, forgotten people, forgotten processes and meanings. And I think it's also connected to the sense of history, which is quite common in Poland. And so the sense of history is a sympathy for the underdog. So the solidarity with the oppressed or unprivileged, underprivileged. And I think the science or history or the historical sciences are also needed. We need them to discover, to conduct this battle for these meanings. And so I'm happy to say, so let's the battle commence. Let's battle begin. And this event will be moderated by my colleague Julia Uchman-Lyszcz. Julia, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Okay, I will sit here, sorry. Okay, so thank you, Mateusz, for this introduction. And I would like to welcome, first of all, our speakers today, Professor Joanna Szewczyk, joining us on Zoom, and Professor Agnieszka Mrozik, who is here. And of course, I would like to welcome our audience. We are very happy that you joined us today for, as Mateusz said, the first event accompanying the exhibition Double Free about Polish women gaining political rights in 1918. Together with my colleagues, we consider this exhibition as a great starting point for a reflection on women's and gender history in Poland, and both in academic and social context. And we want to open up a discussion on the importance of including different perspectives and also women coming from different political backgrounds or social backgrounds, and also reflect on the importance of it in contemporary Poland. In our upcoming events, the next event in April, we'll talk about so-called Ludowa Historia Kobiet, so like people's turn in women's history, and especially present in literature, but also historiography. And in our event in June, we will talk about women in the solidarity movement. In addition, we organized a series of short events during which our guests will present women that are like politicians, activists, artists that often remain still forgotten. So at this point, I would like to introduce our speakers. Professor Joanna Szewczyk is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology of Literature and Cultural Studies at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She works in literary anthropology, feminist literary criticism, 20th century historical novel, women's history. She is the winner of the Monographs program of the Foundation of Polish Science and the author of Historiography and Mythology of Womanhood, the novelism of Theodor Parnicki. She is interested in women's history, feminist theories, and gender theories, melodic discourse, and literary anthropology. At the Jagiellonia University, she teaches classes on literature in the perspective of cultural anthropology, her historical narratives in Polish literature after 1989. She also teaches a course on representations of female madness in literature and culture. And Professor Szewczyk will start, will be the first speaker. And she will be followed by Agnieszka Mrozik. Professor Mrozik is an associate professor of literary studies at the Institute of Literary Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences. She is affiliated with two research units, the Center for Cultural and Literary Studies of Communism and the Women's Archive. She has held fellowships from the Imre Keres Kolleg in Jena, the Institute for Advanced Studies CEU, and the DAAD program at the University of Hamburg. She's the author of Architektki PRL-u, Komunistki, literatura I emancypacja kobiet w powojennej Polsce, translated to Female Architects of the Polish People's Republic, Communist Women, Literature and Women's Emancipation in Post-War Poland. And another publication, Midwives of the Transformation, Women, Literature and Power in Post-1989 Poland. She also co-authored several collective volumes, including Reassessing Communism, Concepts, Culture and Society in Poland, Gender, Generations and Communism in Central and Eastern Europe and Beyond, and Historical Memory of Central and East European Communism. So, as I was saying, we will first hear two presentations, and this will be followed by a short discussion, and we'll very much appreciate your questions from the audience as well. So, thank you very much, and please welcome Professor Szewczyk.
Good evening. First, I would like to thank the Pilecki-Institut for inviting me to participate in this meeting and discussion. I very much regret that I cannot be there together with you. Okay. Ja tylko dopytam, czy moja prezentacja jest widoczna w tej chwili na Państwa ekranie? Okay. I would like to talk about the historic turn in Poland of recent decades. By historical turn, I mean the rise of interest in women's past in the Polish humanities, especially in anthropological, literary and cultural studies. The historical turn involves a reorientation of previous research areas and transdisciplinary alliances with other turns: narrativist, ethical, political, gender, biographical, memory, topographical. The use of the category of turn always has a performative dimension, but in my opinion, the concept of historical turn is not just a manifestation of terminological fashion, The historical term refers to the clear tendencies of the Polish humanities and at the same time indicates the non-final character of the transformation taking place in this field. In my presentation, I would first like to speak briefly about the concept of herstory and the distress it arouses on the ground of Polish historical research, as well as the relationship between women's history and gender history. In the second part, I will discuss some research perspective of the historical term in anthropological and literary studies. In the third and final part, I will present some local and social initiatives related to the historical term. On the ground of Polish research, the concept of herstory, shaped under the influence of American second-wave feminism as an element of criticism of traditional historical writing, is a paradoxical category. On the one hand, it provokes opposition from historians, while on the other hand, it easily settles into critical literary and popular cultural discourse, where it is often misused. It can be said that nowadays herstory is a code word for various initiatives aimed at remembering the past of women, feminists and social activists. According to Dobrowna-Kauwa, the concept of herstory can be a good example of the effect caused by the implementation of concept created under different cultural and linguistic conditions. The term herstory is often invoked by Polish critics of women's history as an argument confirming the low level of feminist research and the tendency to ideological manipulation. One can see the popularity and attractiveness of the Polonized version of the English language term in the humanities, while at the same time the resistance and criticism of professional representatives of academic history who use terms women's history or women's cultural history. In fact, it is a more universal phenomenon, as Sylwia Kuźma-Markowska noted, since the 1980s, researchers in women's history have rarely used the term herstory to describe the subject of their analysis. The term still functions in popular culture and is often used in various feminist endeavors. The concept of the historical term was introduced into Polish scientific discourse by Weronika Grzebalska, author of the monograph Płeć Powstania Warszawskiego, The Gender of the Warsaw Uprising. In her article Od fałszywego uniwersalizmu do fetyszyzacji różnicy, historia powstania warszawskiego i feministyczny zwrot historyczny, from false universalism to the fetishization of difference, the history of the Warsaw Uprising and the revisionist historical term. The researcher focused on paradigms for studying women's experience of participation in the Warsaw Uprising. Grzebalska defines the historical term as a change on the ground of the memory of the Warsaw Uprising, which consists of increasing interest in women and their past, emphasizing the gender diversity of wartime experiences and their asymmetrical representation, and finally reaching for new sources, especially oral history, which remains on the margins of traditional historiography. The false universalism evoked in the title of her article involves filling in the white spots, reclaiming women's history while maintaining a male-centric perspective and traditional value system. The fetishization of difference, on the other hand, focuses on emphasizing the otherness of the experience of women combatants and treats them often as a niche ornament of the political military narrative. The problems identified by Grzebalska demonstrate the dangers of such a research practice. According to the researcher, the herhistorical term should be considered in a broader context as related to the turn of memory, the turn to identity politics, but also to the demand for popular historical literature. Due to different social, political and scientific conditions for the development of women's history in Poland, it is difficult to relate to it the phases of development of this research orientation distinguished in the Anglo-American and French areas. This is especially true of the transformation of women's history into gender history, initiated by Joanna W. Scott Simonal in 1886 text, Gender as Useful Category of Historical Analysis. This proposal emerged in Western historiography at a time when women's history as a research discipline in Poland was just developing. In her articles on the methodology of women's history, Dobrowna-Kauwa drew attention to the clear paradigmatic and epistemological distinctiveness of Polish historical and gender studies, which make up competing conceptualization of the past. According to the researcher, while in Western historiography, Anglo-Saxon or German, there is a visibly rapprochement and interaction between the various cycles of the broadly understood humanities, in Polish conditions, instead of interdisciplinary dialogue and cooperation, we are faced with a situation where the two research currents, historical and gender, remain in opposition to each other, offering different and separate concept and interpretation of women's past. According to Dobrowna-Kauwa, Polish research on women's past develops within the framework of two separate proposals, classic academic historiography and feminist historical humanities. The researchers pointed out that this provokes polemics between representatives of both positions. Representatives of feminist historical humanities accuse historians of being anachronistic. On the other hand, representatives of classical historiography accuse their critics of instrumental treatment of women's history and its ideologization because of the relationship between the categories of gender and feminism criticism. It is not my purpose to set all these two opposing positions in detail. I just wanted to draw attention to the specificity of the development of women's history in Poland and the related dilemmas and research disputes. The important thing is that the past is no longer only the domain of historians' research, but also the subject of interest of the postmodern humanities. I also want to show how women's history functions on the Polish publishing market and in the literary field. One of the manifestations of the historical turn is the growing interest in well-known and lesser-known women of the past. More and more gender-modeled biographies of women writers and artists are appearing on the Polish publishing market. This phenomenon shows the connection between the historical and biographical term and is accompanied by the development of research on the personal biographical documents written by women. The researchers read them from a historical and literary perspective, but also from a critical and feminist point of view. For example, according to Inga Iwasiów, the study of women's wartime experience and their roles in armed conflict must involve uncovering non-canonical autobiographical female narratives located outside of official mainstream history and literary history. It is also necessary to mention the marriage of cultural anthropology and women's biography manifested, among other things, in reconstructing the profile of forgotten or marginalized female folklore researchers, anthropologists, ethnographers, and sociologists. The personal documentary literature they left behind, diaries and memories, is a unique testimony to women's immersion in culture and the world. It is necessary to pay attention to the genre of anthropological biography introduced in Poland by Grażyna Kubica thanks to her monograph Maria Czaplicka, Płeć, Szamanizm, Rasa, translated Maria Czaplicka, Gender, Shamanism, Race. The researcher shows the extensive historical and socio-cultural context in which she places the narrative about the Polish scholar. Kubica recognized the category of gender as an important factor differentiating male and female experiences. Kubica's monograph exemplifies her historical writing in a dual sense, as a story about Czaplicka and other women who entered the space of the university in the first decades of 20th century, and as a reminder of forgotten female contribution to the history of anthropology. The monograph on Maria Czaplicka was preceded by book by Kubica, Siostry Malinowskiego, czyli Kobiety nowoczesne na początku XX wieku, Malinowski's Sister or Modern Women at the Beginning of the 20th Century, which is a story about discovering the biographies of emancipated forgotten women who appeared in Bronisław Malinowski's diary. This monograph is a model example of herstory writing and has become an inspiration for various historical initiatives. A dynamically developing genre in Poland, which is related to the interest in women's past, is historical reportage, which can be considered a kind of unconventional approach to the past. What distinguishes herstory reportage is the presence of marginalized female experience and voice. The genre draws from microhistorical writing, anthropological history, and literary reportage. Historical reportage can be seen as a recovery of women's history, but also as a study of women's culture understood as a specifically female cultural experience represented outside androcentric model of hierarchy and values. This genre is a form of a giving voice to the silent. It is often characterized by a departure from the depersonalized style of historical writing and a reflection on difficult archival research and the lack of sources for the study of women's history. Especially interesting are those historical reportages that reflect on the mechanism of memory historical politics that exclude women. For example, reportages by Marta Dzido, Kobiety Solidarności, Women of Solidarity, and Olga Wiechnik, Posełki, 8 pierwszych kobiet, Female Deputies, The First 8 Women. It is worth noting that their publication that coincided with the anniversary celebration, Marta Dzido's reportage about the Women of Solidarity was published on the 25th anniversary of the political transformation in Poland. Olga Wiechnik's reportage about the first Polish female deputies was published on the 100th anniversary of Poland regaining independence, and at the same time on the anniversary of Polish women gaining the right to vote. The aim of both authors is to restore the memory of women about whom official history is often silent, who, as Olga Wiechnik writes, do not have their own streets, do not have monuments, and are not taught about them in schools. In this way, both Dzido and Wiechnik want to regain a matrilinear bond with their symbolic great-grandmothers, grandmothers and mothers. Born in 1981, Marta Dzido calls herself a daughter of solidarity and thus marks her individual perspective. Drawing attention to the invisibility of women in political activities is associated with reflection on gender stereotypes, as well as on the role of models of femininity and masculinity in the production of national identity. In her narration, Marta Dzido unmasked the traditional gender contract, which assumes an active man and a woman who remains in his shadow. The author of Women's of Solidarity builds her narrative on interviews with activists, but the main theme for her is the research for Ewa Ossowska, who together with Anna Walentynowicz and Alina Pinkowska stopped the workers in the Gdańsk shipyard from breaking the strike. Olga Wiechnik reportage consists of 8 chapters, each of which concerned one female deputies. The first part of each chapter reconstructs the biography and socio-political activity of Zofia Moraczewska. The second one is devoted to the other women from different backgrounds and political groups. Zofia Sokolnicka, Maria Moczydłowska, Jadwiga Dziubińska, Anna Piasecka, Gabriela Balicka, Franciszka Wilczkowiakowa, and Irena Kosmowska. The last chapter contains Zofia Moraczewska's will, which she addressed to Polish women. In this way, Olga Wiechnik gives voice to her protagonist in the afterword. Olga Wiechnik also draws attention to the lack of documents concerning the activities of the first female deputies, both in official and family archives. The exception is Zofia Moraczewska, who recorded her activities in memoirs and letters, but despite this, she is often perceived only as the wife of the first prime minister of the Second Polish Republic. Olga Wiechnik reportage also shows the usefulness of the gender category in historical research. In correspondence with her sister, Zofia Moraczewska wrote about her dilemmas related to her political activity. On the other hand, there are no traces of such doubts in Jędrzej Moraczewski correspondence. Olga Wiechnik analyzes the speeches of the first female deputies who work together across political divides to abolish legislation that was harmful to women. The author shows their extensive reform, educational and social activities, which she confronts with the satires on women's political activity of the time. Another time of her historical reportage are the publication of Marta Madejska, Aleja Włókniarek, Avenue of Female Textile Worker, and Joanna Kuciel-Frydryszak, Służące do Wszystkiego, Female Servants for Everything. Both authors focus not on prominent women, but on female occupational groups that were considered mute, textile industry workers and servants. In their narrative, in addition to the category of gender, the category of social class is very important. In Marta Madejska's reportage, the story of the industrial revolution, migration from the countryside to the cities, the economic crisis in the interwar period, the reconstruction of industry after Second World War, and workers' strikes during the Polish People's Republic is told from the perspective of female workers. Madejska's narrative is also an attempt to tell the story of Łódź as a strongly feminized city in the 19th century. The title of her reportage refers to the city's main thoroughfare, whose name hides the feminization of the textile industry through its grammatical structure. Madejska's reportage is also a reflection on the reconstruction of women's history, the lack of testimonies, and the silence of the workers themselves. The author admits in the introduction that she wanted to tell the story of the past only through the voice of the female workers, but it did not succeed. That is why she reconstructs the history of female workers in Łódź from a few memories based on oral history, pre-war reportage, newsreel, and letters to newspapers. Joanna Kuciel-Frydryszak encountered similar problems when she wrote about women's pre-war domestic servants. In reconstructing their history, the author used a variety of factual material, but it is difficult to find the diaries of female servants. They appear mainly in the memories of their employers, which often have a sentimental and anecdotal dimension. For example, the correspondence between writers and their servants and fictional literature play the role of an important document in which the characters of female servants appear. Joanna Kuciel-Frydryszak writes about domestic servants as a strongly feminized group, but she also evokes exceptional figures of female servants. Blessed Aniela Salawa, Etla Bumsztyk, a Jewish political activist and organizer of trade unions of domestic servants in Warsaw, Maria Luty, a servant of Henryk Sienkiewicz and the guardian of his legacy, Wiktoria Boguszówna, a servant of the ethnographer Seweryn Udziela, who was involved in collecting artifacts for the Ethnographic Museum in Krakow. Kuciel-Frydryszak reconstructs the daily multi-hour work of domestic helpers, which has not been the focus of historians, mainly focused on servant regulation. The author shows the marginalized experience of women who were often victims of crimes and abuse, threatened with prostitution if they lost their job. However, she doesn't see the fate of women serving only in terms of oppression, but also as an opportunity for emancipation, independence from their own patriarchal family. Joanna Kuciel-Frydryszak's writing can be considered a thoughtful project of history from below. Her recent, very well received book about peasant women is part of Poland's folk history, a necessary complement to it. However, the implicit interest in women history in Poland result in a very large number of publications entering the publishing market, which waste the historical potential. I'm thinking especially of non-fiction literature, which places female characters at the center of the narrative, but doesn't not reformulate the male-centric model of traditional history, nor does it attempt to de-hierarchize historical problem. An example is the True Stories series. The publication included in it, aimed mainly at women, are characterized by symptomatic repetition of titles and overly aestheticized graphic design. Literary critics in Poland point out that this rapidly developing trend of narration of women's stories wastes the very interesting topic of women participation in Polish recent history. These publications are limited to recording women's voices and allowing them into the publishing market without commentary or reflection on the problems of women's history. Moreover, this publication often stabilize gender stereotypes rather than break them. Similar problems apply not only to non-fiction, but also to fictional literature. The feminization of the historical novel can also be observed on the Polish publishing market, both due to the growing number of female authors and the interest in women's past as a literary subject. These novels are an attempt to implement the assumptions of women's history, the appreciation of the female point of view, the representation of women's experiences, and the revision of the images of women preserved in history. Unfortunately, they are often characterized by a schematic plot, presentism, and reproduction of stereotypes. Interesting transformation can be seen in the saga, a genre that has a strong connection to family and collective history. Traditional saga often rely on a male narrator and patriarchal structures. However, this genre has been transforming in recent decades. In my opinion, one of the factors that has influenced the transformation of the family novel is the growing interest in women's past. In an unconventional variant of the saga, women are placed at the center of the narrative, reconstructing silenced family histories, discovering the past and searching for their identity. Novels by Joanna, Inga Iwasiów, Martyna Bunda, Anna Dziewit-Meller shatter the seemingly monolithic story of community, often focusing on what does not fit into its mainstream. The protagonists of these novels are Kashubian, Silesian, and lower Silesian women, women who have experienced war trauma, illegitimate daughters, peasant women, and labor leaders who are looking for a place for themselves in the new post-war reality. At the same time, history is more than just a background story in this narrative. The official story is rewritten by the experiences of the female subject. All this makes the family saga a genre in the process, influenced by feminist criticism and women's history, among other things. Interest in women's past has resulted in the publication of popularization herstory books, as well as publication on women's history aimed at non-adult readers. A good example of the first time of publication is Anna Kowalczyk's book Brakująca połowa dziejów, krótka historia kobiet na ziemiach polskich, The Missing Half of History, a short history of women in the Polish lands, illustrated by Marta Frey. The author rejected the chronological perspective and abandoned the linear narrative. Each chapter of her book deals with a different issues. Women's rights, religion, education, labor, art and war. The protagonists of Kowalczyk's narrative are women both famous and forgotten. The author reconstructs their stories and gives them a broad social and political context. The narrative strategy she chose is the result of her own reading experience and feminist perspective. Kowalczyk also reports on the process of writing the book and her own archival research and reveals her own
Pani Joanno, niestety musimy zbliżać się do końca, jeśli nas Pani słyszy. Pani Joanno? Tak. Niestety musimy zbliżać się do końca, jeżeli nas Pani słyszy, ponieważ potrzebujemy jeszcze czasu dla następnych.
Dobrze, to w takim razie ja pominę większość rzeczy i może tak. To conclude my presentation, I would like to talk about several initiatives related to the commemoration of women in urban space, with a special focus on Krakow. A key role in filling in the white blanks of Polish women's history, played by female local activists, enthusiasts, and researchers who undertake various initiatives for historical mapping of Polish cities. Most of these activists are not professional historians. A pioneering role in discovering the traces of women in urban space was played by the Women's Space Foundation, which operated in Kraków from 2019. Its founders, Ewa Furgał and Natalia Sarata, formed a team of 50 women to develop and publish the first series of Herstory guides in Poland. Each of the 5 volumes contained reconstructed biographies and photographs of women associated with Krakow. The foundation has also designed historical trails and organized tours of Krakow in the footsteps of Krakow's suffragettes, Krakow Jewish women, prominent Krakow women, and Virginia Woolf, Krakow's sister. The trail in the footsteps of Krakow's suffragettes included various points on the map of Krakow, the women reading room, one of the most important women's educational institution, which operated at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries on Szpitalna Street. The foundation not only commemorated the reading room, but also reactivated it in 2010 as a place for exchanging herstory experiences and meeting with biographers of women. Już kończę. The foundation has also launched the Women's History Archive, an online knowledge base on women's history. In 2015, the foundation published a guidebook that included a description of routes in the footsteps of women in Polish cities: Gdańsk, Konin, Kraków, Łódź, Milanówek, Poznań, Warsaw. It is worth noting that the initiator of restoring the memory of women defined herstory as a form of social and local activism and civic engagement. The foundation activities were complemented by the intergenerational Herstories project aimed at women under 25 and over 60 years of age. Its aim was to draw attention to the personal dimension of herstory and to engage the participants in reconstructing their own family histories and discovering matrilinear tradition. In my speech, I wanted to outline a wide spectrum of manifestation of the historical turn in Poland, in anthropological and literary research, on the publishing market, and as a part of local initiatives. Of course, I haven't exhausted this topic. In my opinion, the herstory turns is more visible in anthropological and literary studies than is historiography. Although significant changes are also taking place in historical studies in this respect. It is also important to study such phenomena in the field of literature and popular culture that could indicate the trivialization or exhaustion of the concept of herstory. As Dariusz Nowacki has noted, the demand for historical narratives means that the notion of herstory sometimes functions as an effective label, often attached to all stories about women, which obviously leads to the annihilation of this category. However, the historic turn allows reflections on the relation between history, literature, politics, and feminist criticism, and co-creates the Polish landscape of engaged humanities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And right now, please welcome Professor Agnieszka Mrozik.
Thank you. If we could turn on my presentation, that it will be good to start. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to participate in today's event. I have prepared a presentation about the activities about the activities of women who designed and implemented emancipation policies in Poland after the end of the Second World War. And let me begin by saying that I'm always happy that on the occasion of the exhibition on women's activism in interwar Poland, this exhibition we have here, I will be able to talk about how the protagonists of that period found their way into post-war reality, shaping and advancing the program of women's emancipation as one of the pillars of Poland's socialist modernization. So when I attend events like, such as today, I always enjoy the popularization of the history of Polish women and the Polish women's movement at the turn of the 20th century and in the interwar period. However, when we move on to what happened after the end of the Second World War, we realize that the situation of women, and especially women's organizations and activists during that period, is either ignored or framed in a schematic way. In the debate about the history of women in Poland, the post-war period is most often presented as a time of apparent equality. The great educational and professional advancement of Polish women is rarely mentioned, and if it is, then with a number of reservations. It is noted that it was incomplete and, above all, unfinished. Also silenced is the activity of female politicians, intellectuals, and activists committed to designing and implementing the program of socialist modernization, democratization of social relations, and emancipation of women. Strategies differ in this case. It is emphasized, for example, that the post-war female activists, socialists, and communists were dependent on the party in their actions and only followed its directives, which is why their achievements are called top-down emancipation, and this one is treated with reserve and referred to as apparent. If one attempts to do them justice, it is pointed out that, that what they did after 1945 was merely a continuation of interwar activities. From this point of view, the People's Republic of Poland has no merit for women's empowerment and functions as a gap between what existed before the war and what came after 1989. However, I must say that changes in thinking about the social and cultural processes taking place in post-war Poland are already visible on the horizon, and in some research fields they are quite advanced. They are most strongly evident in the historical research. A number of works have appeared in recent years that attempt to look at the post-war period from a different, not strictly political black and white perspective. And I'm referring here to the publications by Małgorzata Fidelis, Women, Communism and Industrialization in Post-War Poland, and Natalia Jarska, Women of Marble, Women Workers in Poland, 1945-1960, who comprehensively discuss state socialist Poland's policies toward women in the labor market, identifying emancipatory but also traditionalist solutions in this regard, and they focus primarily in the on the first 15 years after the war. There is also a book by 4 historians, Katarzyna Stańczak-Wiślicz, Piotr Perkowski, Małgorzata Fidelis, and Barbara Klich-Kluczewska, Women in Poland 1945-1989, Modernity, Equality, Communism, which goes beyond the Stalinist period and examines the intersection of emancipatory and traditionalist solutions in the gender politics of state socialist Poland in various areas of social life, in the family, in sexual relations, in attitudes toward the body. There are also works that attempt to look at state socialist Poland and its emancipation policies from the perspective of other disciplines, and these include the works of anthropologist Agnieszka Kościańska, who examines the development of sexological discourse in Poland in 1970s and 1980s, and film scholar Monika Talarczyk-Gubała, who analyzes the activities of socialist realist filmmaker Wanda Jakubowska using new tools and from a new perspective. Finally, by far the latest came publications that attempt to look at the diverse literary output of women after 1945, going beyond its usual interpretations. And I'm referring here not only to my book, you have it on the left or right, whatever. My book about Women Architects of the Polish People's Republic, Communist Women, Literature and Women's Emancipation in Post-War Poland. And my book examines, among other things, the commitment of communist women writers to emancipation processes after the war. But also we have a new book by Katarzyna Szopa, An Explosion of the Imagination, Anna Świerczyńska's poetry and the reproduction of social life, which brings a new reading of Anna Świerczyńska's poetry through the lens of materialist feminism. And finally, there is a book by sociologist Magdalena Grabowska, Broken Genealogy, Women's Socio-Political Activity After 1945 and the Contemporary Women's Movement. This book tells the story of women politicians and activists who created and implemented emancipatory solutions working in organizations such as Women's League or in the party units such as Women's Division of the Polish United Workers' Party. Grabowska argues that professional female politicians submitted projects to improve the situation of women in the labor market. They provided opinions on political projects and lobbied for them. The protagonists of her book include, for example, Edwarda Orłowska, who in the late 40s, early 50s was the chairwoman of the women's division, first of the Polish Workers' Party, then from the Polish United Workers' Party. Here we have also in the middle Eugenia Pragierowa, who was a socialist, not a communist. Before the war, she was in the Polish Socialist Party, then in the Polish United Workers' Party, and also Irena Stachelska. This is the lady, here, who at the late 40s, early 50s was chairwoman of the Women's League, which was the official mass women's organization in State Socialist Poland. So my research begins where Grabowska's research ends. That is, I expand the view of women's activism after the war to include those protagonists who were active at the intersection of several fields, not only women's rights, but also education, science and culture, and of course politics. For many of my protagonists, women's activism was not in the foreground, and not all of them were active in this field before the war. But for most of them, women's emancipation was part of the socialist modernization program, which they tried to pursue in various fields. So I would like to speak about three elements of this program, namely about the education reform project, the situation of women at the labor market, and then the activism of my protagonist at the international forum, which may be, I think, maybe most interesting for you. Yeah. So, yes, so, yeah. So, as for the education reform project, known immediately after the war as the third reform, following the agrarian reform and nationalization of industry, several names are worth mentioning, and I will go back to that slide. So here we have the important names. Żanna Kormanowa, the lady here, who was the director of the Department of Education Reform at the Ministry of Education in the late 40s. Zofia Dębińska, and please remember Zofia Dębińska and Eugenia Krasowska, because I will get back to them later in my presentation. So Dębińska was the Deputy Minister of Education from 1951 to 1960, and Eugenia Krasowska served as Deputy Minister first at the Ministry of Education and then at the Ministry of Higher Education from 1946 to 1965. So the research shows that, that access to free public education for children and youth, as well as adults, was one of the priorities of the People's Government during its first period in office. And I will go back to that slide, because sociologist Agata Zysiak, in her book Limiting Privilege, Upward Mobility within Higher Education in Socialist Poland, shows how these postulates, how these demands were implemented in Łódź, where young people from the popular classes were enrolled in the newly established university. Zysiak analyzes the phenomenon of educational advancement in Stalinist Poland, but also the later history of this advancement, including the process of reducing the percentage of rural and working class students, which had already begun in the wave of the Stalinization. The protagonists of my research are women who created the education reform project after the war. I realize that today these names, these women may not have positive associations. But in this talk, I would like to highlight their efforts to facilitate access to public education for children, for youth, and for adults from different social classes. These efforts aim to eliminate illiteracy, but also to overcome class and gender divisions in access to knowledge. These were important elements of the socialist modernization program. And the politicians I have already mentioned, I'll go back to, so these politicians, among other, were all teachers by training. They were very well prepared to take on political work in the organization of education. And let's keep in mind that after the end of the Second World War, some 15 to 18% of Polish society were people who could not read and write or had problems with it. So it's hardly surprising that the postulate of universal access to education was, as I mentioned, one of the priorities of the new government. As for the education of girls, the need to educate them in vocational and technical schools, including engineering studies, was emphasized. This project began to break down at some point in the late 60s and early 70s. There were claims that too many women were studying in technical fields, that they were taking places away from men. It's worth remembering this conservative message. However, this doesn't change the fact that after the war, women were given the opportunity for education on an unprecedented scale, and also the chance for an academic career, including holding leadership positions in education. The excellent education of women in Poland is one of the legacies of the communist era. My protagonists, however, headed not only ministries or departments responsible for education, they also headed publishing houses, magazine editorial offices, and libraries. They were everywhere where laws were not only enacted, but also ensured that they became the practice of life. Speaking of emancipation in its historical sense, I refer to the findings of German historian and theorist of historiography Reinhard Koselleck, who in his inspiring essay, The Limits of Emancipation, made 3 observations, and you have them on the slide. First, legal emancipation is a necessary but never a sufficient condition for effective equal rights. Second, the legal principle of equal rights for all human beings around the world is proclaimed not only as a legal norm, but practiced as a politically necessary and consciously enforced principle of justice for securing our very survival. And finally, no emancipation can merely place individuals on an equal footing. It must always include the interhuman relationships within which people actually live. What does it mean? Of course, we can provide interpretations here. What's important for me is how I understand Koselleck's words is not enough just to pass the right regulations. They must also become a practice of life, be known and understood by a society, including women. And let me give some examples. Some of the key laws, key legal regulations from the point of view of women and children passed in Poland after the war concerned introducing civil marriages, the possibility of obtaining divorces, and equalizing the rights of children born to married and unmarried couples, including by establishing a maintenance obligation. For many years, the women's press, such as the magazine Kobieta, Woman, whose editor-in-chief was the writer Janina Broniewska, or the most widely read weekly for women after the war, Przyjaciółka, Girlfriend, headed by Anna Lanota, not only informed women of their rights, but also shaped public opinion regarding the status of unmarried women who were also mothers. If we realize that today more than a quarter of children are born out of wedlock, which is accepted as a social fact, then 80 years ago, such a phenomenon would have been met with strong stigmatization of women. The protagonists of my research have done a lot to inform Polish women about their rights, but also to eradicate in them the feeling of inferiority, the belief that being a single mother is something shameful. Another area in which leftist women writers, publicists, critics, screenwriters were active after the war concerned the position of women in the labor market. The post-war period, especially the Stalinist period with its 6-year plan, opened up access for women to so-called men's jobs, which in public debate began to be called new professions to avoid their gender assignment. Many female intellectuals, activists, and politicians made every effort to enable women to work as miners, cranes, steel workers. well-paid and prestigious at the time, though of course not only in these professions, because Poland, which was rebuilding from the devastation of war and undergoing hasty industrialization, also needed people working in healthcare, education and administrations. The phrases appearing in the debate about the need to increase women's labor force participation sounded extremely emancipatory. As early as 1948, in a brochure entitled The End of the Kingdom of Saucepans, writer Wanda Żółkiewska encouraged her female readers to enter the labor market more actively. And here we have a quote: "For in addition to the tradition of copper saucepans, the tradition of bitter, bored slaves, thoughtless or tragic, the traditions of great women, scholars, fighters for freedom and justice, writers, painters, creators of life and culture are known." Another writer, Janina Dziarnowska, wrote in 1952, and I very much like this quote: "Men's work, women's work. That's what people repeated over and over again. That's what they were taught. A woman too weak to stand at the machine with iron, with steel, but to stand 15 hours non-stop at the bale. She was not too weak. Sacks of flour, of potatoes in the countryside, she could also carry, half bent with a sickle, with a hoe in the heat. But at the machine, no. Who came up with something like that?" On the other hand, Helena Bobińska, in her children's book, The Pioneers, first published in Moscow in 1924 and later reissued in 1951, proclaimed a message that the intellectual mother of second-wave feminism, Simone de Beauvoir, would not be ashamed of. "It is widely known that dinners are best when girls are on the duty in the kitchen, because to them, somehow, the groats never burn and the soap never gets oversalted. But to this, the boys have the argument that cooking is a woman's thing and that they know how to do it from birth, which of course is not true, because a newborn girl is just as incapable of cooking as a just-born boy." If you remember the famous work by Simone de Beauvoir, The Second Sex, in which she wrote that no one is born a woman but becomes one. So the Beauvoir and Bobińska drew from the same Marxist tradition, but somehow the Polish writer articulated her thought first. Another tool important in this process of building new society and new culture was film. This was a tool through which new values, new lifestyles, new professions were promoted. And for example, if we take an example of the 1954 socialist realist film classic The Boss Lives at 6:20, based on a script by Wilhelmina Skulska and Jan Rybkowski. Its protagonist was a hairdresser who moved from a small town to Silesia, where she took a job as a welder, gained an education and the respect of her community, and finally fixed her relationship with her husband. I'm not sure if you saw this movie. It's very classic socialist realist style. This was the model of modern womanhood of the time. Even if it didn't survive, even if it changed, for many women it was an inspiration. It's enough to cite the memoirs of Anna Walentynowicz, the famous crane woman from the Gdańsk shipyard, whose firing led to mass protests in the summer of 1980 and the establishment of the Solidarity movement. So here is a quote from the memoirs of Anna Walentynowicz. "I remember such a picture, a very popular poster, a girl with a hammer and a saw, smiling and determined, a real worker who, together with other workers, was building a new, better world. The poster immediately made a very big impression on me. I began to imagine that this was me." So for my protagonist, the project of women's emancipation was part of a great social change encompassing all spheres of life. They understood gender inequality as part of social inequality in general, as a result of the intersecting axis of domination and oppression. The social situation of women could not change without changing the situation of other social groups, primarily the popular classes. Therefore, my protagonist participated in implementing systemic solutions, similar to contemporary solutions such as quotas, for example. For example, in the field of education, points for origin, punkty za pochodzenie, had been in place since the late 60s. They were one of the tools used to ensure that working class and peasant youth had more equal access to higher education. Quotas were also used to ensure that women were equally presented on factory councils during the Stalinist period. All of this was aimed at effectively implementing emancipation policies. And I will skip this slide and move to the last point of my presentation, in which I would like to discuss women's activities for women or for more just societies in the international arena. Polish women were part of a broad socialist feminist front. This is from the vocabulary of the era. That is, emancipation activities held in the forum of international institutions and organizations. They were active, for example, and here you have some of these institutions in which my protagonists were active. So they were active, for example, in the Women's International Democratic Federation. I'm not sure if you know this organization or heard about it. So this organization was founded in Paris just after the war and carried out 4 main slogans on its banners: fighting for women's rights, for children's rights, against fascism, and for peace. I think these slogans are quite relevant today as well. Another organization, UNESCO, I think I don't have to introduce. Eugenia Krasowska, if you remember the lady from the previous slides, who was this Deputy Minister of Science and Higher Education. She represented Poland in UNESCO from late 60s to early 80s. She was chairwoman of the Polish National Commission for UNESCO, as well as a member of the UNESCO Executive Board. As part of her work for the organization, she insisted on guaranteeing women and girls the right to education and access to culture, emphasizing that these were fundamental human rights. In 1975, she called on UNESCO to become more actively involved in celebrating the International Women's Year. Discussing UNESCO's role in the post-war world, she highlighted the political nature of its activities. Access to education and culture itself, the struggle against illiteracy, were, in her view, political issues, as their implementation depended on political conditions in individual countries and region. That's why in her public statement she didn't want to separate the discussion of the rights of the right to public and free education from the discussion of the apartheid in South Africa or the situation of Palestinians in the Israeli occupied territories. So I don't have time to explain or discuss all the activities of my protagonists in all other institutions. I just would like to share with you my two findings, my two discoveries. First, I would like to say a few words about Fryderyka Kalinowska. It's the second lady from that side. She was a Polish leftist, Polish-Jewish leftist civil servant, today completely forgotten, not only in the public debate, but also in scholarly research. Kalinowska was one of 7 women from around the world who in 1946 became members of the United Nations subcommission on the status of women, which was later transformed into a commission a few months later. Attending sessions of the United Nations so-called Third Committee for Social, Humanitarian and Cultural Issues, she made significant contribution to the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Who heard about this woman before? I haven't. So it's a pity, of course, that the Polish government of that time didn't consider accepting the results of her and her colleagues' work. Poland didn't sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Poland didn't veto it as well, but abstained from signing. Another example, which may be interesting to people living in Berlin, Wanda Tytzner, whom I interviewed, I think, last in her life. She was the editor-in-chief of the Women of the Whole World. This was the press organ of the Women's International Democratic Federation, so this organization which was established in Paris in 1948. From a conversation which I had with her in 2018, I learned that Polish women, as part of the division of work among the Federation's member organizations, became responsible for editing this magazine, which in the pre-internet era served as the kind of link between women around the world. Titzner told me about the huge archive of letters that came to the editorial office of this magazine, and this magazine was located in East Berlin at Unter der Linden 13 for many years until the organization left Berlin at 1990 or 1991. So women from all over the world wrote about what was going on in different regions of the world. They shared their anxieties, their dreams. So these few examples show that in the second half of the 20th century, Polish women were very active in the international arena, and not only in matters concerning women. So what conclusions I would like to propose based on my presentation? First, it's necessary to conduct extensive research on the history of women and the women's movement in the People's Republic of Poland. Such research is already underway, as I said, but there is still much to be done in this area. This is not just a matter of completing the list of missing names and biographies, dates and achievements of failures, but also an attempt to look at the period of state socialism as an integral part of our history and not merely a specific slice of it, with no links to the earlier period or to the present. Second, I consider it crucial to raise methodological questions, including the conceptualizations of such terms as emancipation, empowerment, modernization, and agency. It's important to look at how different subjects of women history, how different women thought about emancipation, how they understood their own agency. And finally, and this is not only my postulate, not only my expectation, but above all that of the new studies of global history, including the global history of women and women's movement, it's the need for research to go beyond the national context, to look at the activities of our protagonists, the organizations in which they were active, and the processes in which they participated in a broader inter- and transnational perspective. This provides an opportunity to go beyond the peculiar methodological nationalism that characterizes much of the research on Polish history, and which we increasingly need to uphold as researchers, but also as participants in the public debate. Research going beyond methodological nationalism is already underway, conducted by the foreign scholars I mentioned in my presentation. And I also would like to show you the recent publications in this the global history of women and women's movement. The first one is about Cuba. The second one is about China. Here we have a book by Christine Gotzi about how women from first, second, and third worlds were discussing, arguing, but also finding some common ground during the International Women's Year and the decade of women in the late 70s and early 50s, and the most recent book by Franziska de Haan, edited by Franziska de Haan, Professor Franziska de Haan, the Palgrave Handbook of Communist Women Activists around the world. What is interesting, but also sad in a way, is that many of the names of Polish leftist female politicians, activists, and intellectuals working on women's rights in the second half of the 20th century now reach us through a circular route, that is, through the work of foreign female researchers. So we learn about these names, not doing our own research in Polish archives, but we learn from these women active, especially in the international forum, through works of foreign scholars, which is interesting but sad as well. So this is them who make us realize that Polish women actively participated in creating an ideologically committed vision of the post-war world, including developing a leftist concept of social, political, and cultural order. And I think it's high time for Polish scholars to open up to this field of research and mark their or our place in it more boldly. Thank you very much, and sorry it was too long, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much to both of the speakers. I'm really sorry that we are running out of time, but it is what it is. So I guess maybe I will just ask you one question, and then I hope that maybe some of you will have questions to both our speakers. yeah, I'm just like wondering, it's a very general question, I know, and a very broad one, but I've read in your interview with Wanda Tytzner that she said she was never approached when it comes to, because she was also fighting in the Warsaw Uprising, right? And she was only approached by scholars or anybody, only because of that part of her biography. And also she mentioned that there wasn't much interest from activists, from feminist activists. So my question would be, why? Why, even though like the history of feminist research and women's history studies is already, it's been a couple of years. So why there are so many white spots in the research on especially communist women in Poland?
Thank you for this question. I think, the Tytzner also, Wanda Tytzner, you saw her on one of the last slides. She said yes, that she was approached by the historians or researchers working on the Polish history of the history of the war period, wartime period, the Warsaw Uprising, but the 40 or 50 years of her life after the war were completely like ignored by researchers, also by feminist scholars. So it was very interesting, it was very sad, but she was very patient, I would say, about that, because she said, well, of course, I understand we live in such political or historical moment when this topic is a not very comfortable one. It's a very politicized topic, and she even used the word propaganda is so widespread that it's very difficult to just to talk about this post-war time and see what happened there. So yes, I think that this I agree with her. I mean, it's so. The situation of women is one thing, because what I wanted to also, I'm not sure if I managed to do this, but the first, let's say, wave of books, of publications about the post-war history, they referred to the history of women. So this is like, I would say, more safe. Yeah, we can try to find out what happened in the sphere of women's work, of women's education, and see how women themselves try to somehow respond to changes. They oppose to these changes or they accepted them. But when we come to the situation of the women's organizations and women's activists or politicians or intellectuals, or all these women whom I try to kind of examine, who not all of them, the women's emancipation was the priority. I mean, they had it in the back of their heads, but this was not the primary activity. So when we come to this moment, to this element of the post-war reality, we are like stepping on a very unsafe, I would say, ground, because we come to the politics, we come to the involvement of the state. Then there comes we start to think about the concept of emancipation itself. We try to think whether true, real emancipation is the bottom up, or maybe top down, or maybe they meet in the somewhere in halfway, or something like that. So, so I think that this, and we don't have this problem when we discuss the women's organization of the interwar period or the 19th century period, because, well, we always get to the moment that, women's organization, women's politicians in the 1918, they won us, I mean women, political rights, and this is safe. When we when we try to see what happened after 1945, and these are very often the same women. This is interesting because most of my protagonists, I didn't say that, but I think you saw the dates of their birth and death. These were women who were also active in the interwar period. Many of them, they were socialists, they were communists, they were social democrats, and these women survived the war, and then the new opportunities, a new political situation opened up for them, and they tried to kind of implement these postulates which they have from the interwar period. So this is, I think, very political, still very political. It's very difficult to discuss, problematic to discuss this element. But I would like to emphasize, I just would like you us to remember from today's conversation, which is also kind of more interesting to me right now. It's this involvement of Polish women, socialists, communists, after the Second World War in this international area, in our international forum. Polish women, and we don't know that. I mean, we really don't know that. It's so sad that we get these names from the work of our foreign colleagues who are working on this topic, that we get these names and these activities from them. And of course, Polish women were also active before the Second World War in the international arena. So I think that after historical and other turns, we really need a kind of a turn to the global history of women and to see where Polish women, Polish activists are on this map. Sorry for this very long explanation. I'm very excited about this global element of the women's history and this kind of old and new field I'm trying to follow.
Thank you very much. I feel very inspired right now. Are there any questions from the audience? Maybe some questions to our first speaker about methodology, or any other questions you have? Yes.
Yeah, maybe a question to Agnieszka, if that's okay. You were stressing very much these international relations, and I was wondering if you have any information or research on the comparison. Like, you were stressing very much the role of Polish communist women. How do they position themselves in comparison with like women from the GDR or from the Soviet Union? How were they interacting with each other maybe? Do you have any information or research on that?
Thank you for this question. I start doing this research. So on the very beginning, very preliminary phase of my research, I would say that. But from what I read and what I studied, the main the press organ of the Women's League. This was the biggest mass women's organization in the state socialist Poland. So I learned that they had and it was an interesting discovery, I would say, that they have very strong relations with women from the GDR. With the women's organization and organizations, they were invited. They were visits and revisits. So this was a kind of interesting, because just after the war, such intense relations were established. But I cannot say much about that. But it's very interesting. In general, I emphasize, yes, you are right, I emphasize this, let's say, international global element, but what's also important to research, and I'm not sure if anyone is doing this research already, is to examine the connections, the contacts and relations between women's organizations in the region. They here in the Central Eastern Europe, they were, of course, they were part of the same bloc, but it's very interesting to observe what I've learned. As I said, it's very preliminary phase of my research, but I realized that not always Soviet Union was involved in this contacts. I mean, these were kind of bilateral relations, which were kind of established apart from the Soviet Union. So this is also very interesting, I would say, to see, to examine.
Yeah, thank you for that. Maybe, does anybody have any other questions from the audience? Mateusz?
If I have.
Do you have a question?
So maybe a question.
Yes.
Question more, maybe more a comment or proposal. So because your interest is of course what happened after the war in the Soviet part of the Cold War, but my question would be about, or research desiderata would be about the women who were women activists before the war in Poland. They were, after the war, for example, in exile in London, very often very poor and very sad situation. Even these women who were part of the elites of the pre-war Poland, so Aleksandra Szczerbińska, so Wanda Pełczyńska, and other. And this is a question to both of you, so both speakers. So maybe is this any field or any research on that? How these women who were leftist and communist in Poland after the war, so was there any connection, or was there any link, or any taking into account these women who were at that time, for example, in London?
I think it's a very good question. I didn't come across such relations because probably I focused on this particular activists and organizations. But I think that this could also kind of inspire further work on this, let's say, international context. So this is also, of course, part of this big international sphere of relations, of interactions. But yeah, I'm speaking very honestly. I didn't.
This is just a comment in line with your proposal that you are interested in this global history of women movement, and of course, so I know that there is the strict line of the Cold War, so between the two worlds. Yes. Może jakieś pytanie do pani w tym.
Sorry. Yeah, I also wanted to ask Professor Szewczyk, because you were telling us about this activist networks or projects such as Krakowski Szlak Kobiet, and maybe you could say something more about the possibilities and or like importance of I guess feminist scholars and activists in the way of in terms of popularization of herstories and the feminist discourse. Maybe Karolina will translate if it's needed.
Okay. Thank you very much. Chętnie skorzystam z tłumaczenia. Rzeczywiście mam takie poczucie, że działalność Krakowskiej Fundacji Przestrzeń Kobiet była bardzo pionierska i właściwie to ona uruchomiła taką ekspansję chociażby szlaków kobiet w całej Polsce, w różnych regionach Polski, nie tylko w tych większych miastach, ale również w tych mniejszych. Co więcej, to nie były jedyne obszary działalności Fundacji Przestrzeni Kobiet, ponieważ ta fundacja prowadziła też na przykład szkolenia dla edukatorek z zakresu historii kobiet. To, co było bardzo ciekawe, to chociażby reaktywacja tej wspomnianej przeze mnie czytelni dla kobiet, która miała być takim miejscem wymiany doświadczeń, spotkań z autorkami, które na przykład badają biografie kobiet albo które są autobiografkami. Oprócz tego, co jak sądzę było bardzo ciekawe, Fundacja Przestrzeń Kobiet stworzyła taką sieć herstoryczną, która miała łączyć zarówno rozmaite stowarzyszenia zainteresowane odzyskiwaniem pamięci o kobietach, jak i jak gdyby indywidualne badaczki czy aktywistki i propagować wiedzę o rozmaitych inicjatywach herstorycznych. No i myślę, że warto tutaj wspomnieć o jeszcze jednym projekcie tej fundacji, który się nazywał Międzypokoleniowe Herstorie. Ja o nim trochę wspominałam i ten projekt zakładał jak gdyby taką aktywizację herstoryczną kobiet poprzez tworzenie opowieści o kobietach ze swoich rodzin, poprzez badanie tych rodzinnych archiwów. Więc myślę, że to było też takie bardzo ciekawe dopełnienie działalności tej fundacji, która rzeczywiście ma niezaprzeczalne zasługi w Polsce, jeśli chodzi o propagowanie propagowanie wiedzy o kobietach i ten rozwój historii kobiet. Natomiast
przepraszam, że tylko wejdę w słowo, żeby tutaj Karolina mogła przetłumaczyć to.
Okay, right now. Okay. So I mentioned the Krakow-based network, the Path of Women, Szlak Kobiet, which gave possibilities of establishing paths to follow female scholars and activists and to popularize Herstories, or the Herstory as a term. And there was lots of wonderful activities of this foundation or the network, this Szlak Kobiet. The foundation Women's Space, that was absolutely a pioneering one. There was an expansion of these women's trails all around Poland in big cities and small cities, and there was also lots of other activities of that foundation. For example, there was trainings for educators that were linked to the history of women. There was also a reactivation of a reading room for women, and that was reactivated to allow for an exchange of experiences, for meetings with authors, for research of biographies of women, and also meetings with authors of these biographies and autobiographies. Plus, this foundation also established a network of Herstories that was supposed to combine and connect memories of women and individual researchers who were researching that histories, but also like institutions, so like a large network to bring everybody together and to popularize knowledge about Herstories and these kinds of initiatives. Plus, one more very important project of that foundation was an intergenerational Herstory researched through researching narratives about women that stem from family archives and analysis of these archives. So the activities of that foundation are of absolutely extraordinary importance for researching women's and female history in Poland and for propagating, disseminating this knowledge about women.
Thank you. Czy ma Pani jeszcze coś do dodania? Też niestety znowu kończy nam się czas, więc...
Oczywiście nie, to na tym poprzestańmy. Dziękuję. Okay. Thank you very much.
That will be it.
Yes. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. We can continue this conversation unofficially if you feel like it. But yeah, I would like to thank all of you, our amazing speakers, and the audience. I hope that during this program we can have a space for conversation, as I was saying, opening up the discussion and reflecting on, yeah, women's and gender history, and talk about why we should reflect more on that. So thank you so much again, and yeah. Yes, of course, please.
One thing, if you are doing research on the post-war period, I don't know if you are doing or if you're studying it or whatever, here in Germany or in Poland or in other countries, just let's keep in mind that the protagonists of the history, the women, also men who made this history, they are kind of dying species. I would say they are quite old. I mean, I did this interview with Wanda Tytzner. I think she was over 90. Now I also would like to do another interview with a woman who is 98. I'm trying to be in touch with her, Halina Krzywdzianka, another not known name. She was the editor-in-chief of the rural youth weekly Zarzewie in the 60s and 70s. But for me, it's interesting that she was also a war correspondent in Vietnam during the war in Vietnam, and she wrote and sent her reports from that war, and they were also published in the form of a book. So we need to be hurry, I mean, if we want to do this research, because these people are dying. I mean, for a long time they were waiting for scholars who will approach them, and yeah, so this is like my sad reflection after this interview with Wanda Tytzner. We wanted to continue this conversation, and I realized, I mean, I heard from her family that she was ill and she died. So yeah, so we need to hurry.
Yeah, I think it's also a very inspiring reflection that we'll all hopefully leave this room today and think about what more can we do. Yes, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the organizers and Professor Mrozik for a fascinating presentation. Thank you.